websites, and I found these very different messages for disabled visitors on the websites of two major art museums. The first museum website tells me the price of admission and that of one companion. The price is the same. In both cases, it's free. I appreciate this thoughtfulness for economic access, since nearly all people with permanent disabilities live below the poverty line. The website for the second museum has a strikingly different tone. It tells me the admission price for a disabled visitor and the price for one companion. But note that while the first museum presumes that anyone might be accompanying me, the second museum assumes that my companion will be a caregiver. There are a number of ways that this is problematic. First, it tells me as a museum visitor that I and my access needs are going to be viewed through a medical lens. Second, it requires me to identify my companion as a caregiver in order to receive the discounted ticket that's available. Putting that language there encourages the ticket staff to give my tickets to my companion with the words, "Here's your caregiver ticket and her disabled ticket," or perhaps even worse, to ask the person accompanying me to prove that they are in fact my caregiver. Now, imagining this happening if I'm on a date, or with a prospective employer, or with my adult daughter. Using medical language such as caregiver presumes that people with disabilities only attend museums with non-disabled people in a helper role. The history of disabled people in museums tells a very different story. People with disabilities have been in museums since they opened. We're making the art on the walls, we're volunteers, we're docents, we're staff, as well as visitors. As early as 1908, the Metropolitan Museum in New York provided chairs on wheels so that visitors could move comfortably between exhibits. In this photograph from 1922, students, most of them riding wheelchairs, are visiting exhibits at the Met. The numbers of disabled people visiting museums continues to climb. As museums increase accessibility for disabled visitors, the benefits and enjoyments spread to other non-disabled visitors who enjoy things such as captions on videos, touch tours, more seating, lowered display cases, and universally designed mobile multimedia guides. Recently, the Smithsonian invited visitors to provide audio descriptions on their mobile devices for the 136 million objects in the Smithsonian's public collections. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and those of you that do budgeting, extremely cost effective. Museum experts on audio description, such as UC Berkeley's Georgina Klieg, and apparently this thing is just gonna flip around when it wants to, so find that audio descriptions from a variety of viewpoints, such as through crowdsourcing, provides richer and more useful information to the visitors that use them. While great strides are being made on the visitor side, it can be harder to see the shifts on the curatorial side. Like so many communities before us, people with disabilities have been largely absent in curatorial rooms. There are many reasons for this, but the impact is easily seen by visitors. One common problem is that even when our bodies are present, our disabled selves are often erased. In 2011, I grew up in Boston, so it was my home museum, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, new exhibit on pre-Columbian artifacts. Thank you. Sorry about this, guys. I'm not doing anything. So there were two small statues which clearly showed disabled bodies. One showed a person with osteogenesis imperfecta, otherwise known as brittle bone disease, and the other showed an adult with achondroplasia dwarfism. Both were mislabeled by the museum. The figure showing the person, which was there for a second, with brittle bone disease was labeled as an imaginary figure, while the adult with dwarfism was labeled as a child. As a disabled visitor, I immediately knew that there was no disability expertise in the curatorial rooms for that exhibit. I knew this because these types of disabled bodies are part of my visual library that I developed over years of knowing people with different disabilities as my friends and colleagues. I imagine that for the curatorial staff of that exhibit, they didn't expect disabled people, our experiences and bodies, to be present in their collections. AV person, can we fix this? It's doing whatever it wants to do when it wants to do it, and it's messing my jam up. Okay, so now we're actually going to start with this actual slide. Asian American deaf artist, but we're going to flip around anyway. Asian American deaf artist Christine Sun Kim captures the frustration of disabled artists dealing with museums in her series, Degrees of My Deaf Rage in the Art World. As an artist, she is furious that, quote, curators who think it's fair to split my fee with interpreters, which she represents graphically by the level of rage. And in the next slide, which we were seeing at some point, which is actually this one, as a deaf artist trying to bring more deaf people into museums, she has full-on rage for museums with zero deaf programming and no deaf docents or educators. And notice her choice of language here. She's not saying ASL, fluent American Sign Language fluent. She's actually talking about people who are culturally and linguistically deaf, bringing the deaf body and the deaf experience into the museum rooms. As Richard Sandell, a museum disability expert from the Research Center for Museums in England, tartly states, quote, if you look in most museums, you'd think disabled people didn't exist, but they're the biggest minority in the world. I can guarantee every museum has material in their storerooms that can speak to the story of disabled people. Now, one of the main goals of my talk today is to invite you to consider questions that may not have occurred to you in regards to Frida Kahlo and her work. I'll be putting questions throughout this presentation, but here are some that specifically refer to the benefits and limitations of having a person like me with a specific demographic give this talk. I'm a white, queer, US-born woman who has polio. At various points in my life, like Frida, I walked, I used a cane, and used wheelchairs. Disabled family, move around and make noise. This is your time. Every time you see one of these, feel free to move. What do you get by having a physically and culturally disabled person talk about Frida Kahlo? What do you miss when that person is white, US-born, and raised? What perspectives would Latinx disabled artists bring to exhibits on Frida Kahlo? And how would Mexican disabled artists curate and interpret the items that we're going to be seeing next month in this exhibit, and also and there's many exhibits of Frida Kahlo stuff all over the world. Everyone is touched by disability. Unless we die very young in an accident, almost all of us will experience illness or disability as we age. Trauma and disability are essential parts of what make us human and what connects us to one another. Those with more trauma and disability carry more of the burden of stigma and ableism, and yet these are near universal human experiences. This is a quote from Rabbi Elliot Kukla, and we're coming back to him a little later. Over the past few decades, the US Census has included people with disabilities. The most recent data shows that nearly 1 in 5 Americans lives with a disability. Yet most people don't realize that because we've all been taught from a very young age that having a disability is not a positive characteristic, so people often hide their disabilities. This problem is not unique to the US, but is a widespread issue around the world. The reason that disabled people are not in your classrooms or on your jobs is purely because we systematically exclude people with disabilities from the non-disabled mainstream. I'm laying this groundwork before we talk about Frida Kahlo because it is impossible to discuss Kahlo and her work without understanding that her experiences as a person with a visible disability directly impacted not only her daily life, but also how her life and work is interpreted in museums. What are the implications of ignoring Frida Kahlo's disabilities when we discuss her life and work? What are the implications of only focusing on her disability and ignoring her gender, class, and country? So for people providing access support, when I get to the questions, they're literally, I'm reading from the screen. The myth of normal. One of the biggest myths about Frida Kahlo is that she is an aberrant other. She's often viewed as being broken, sick, ashamed of her body, or just plain weird. All of these framings presume that there is a, quote, normal body, one that is not sick or injured or, quote, just too different. The image on this slide shows Akemi Nishida, a Japanese disabled woman who's currently a professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's standing at a disability rights rally holding a sign that states, quote, normal is a drier setting, exclamation points. The disability rights movement is founded on the belief that disabled people face multiple barriers that limit their life opportunities, and that being disabled is a political act despite society's failure to recognize disability as a valid identity with its own community, history, culture, and stake in all socio-political issues. And since, Persimmon Blackbridge is a queer, disabled, white feminist artist. Her work looks at identities and how they are inscribed on our bodies. And there's a series of 3 sculptures on each of these 2 slides. Blackbridge notes, when an artist makes a figure, they are confronted with all the identities that society reads onto our physical selves: gender, race, size, ability, and disability. You can grapple with how to represent our complex and diverse selves, or you can pretend that some default, quote, normal body represents us all in our wild human difference. Next, I'm going to be exploring ways to think about Frida Kahlo's experience of disability. But just as women go through the world having very different experiences than men, people with visible disabilities go through the world having very different experiences than people who are not disabled. Since Hillary just talked about this slide, I'm just going to make a couple of quick points. This is the slide of the 3 photographs that Frida's dad took of her and her drawing of them, and the drawing relates to the images of herself right after she got polio and right after she had a major bus accident. And the point I want to go to here, okay. So it's striking to me that in all the accounts we have of Frida Kahlo's childhood after she had polio, she was not only attending schools and getting a good education, but she was also working with her father in his photography studio. Research by the National Center on Parents with Disabilities shows that children who grow up with disabled parents become better at problem solving and more resilient than children who do not grow up with disabled parents. To me, an entire line of research opens up when we look at what it meant for Frida Kahlo to grow up with a disabled father who also worked as a professional photographer. Question: what was the impact? What was the impact on Frida Kahlo of growing up with a disabled father? I want to pause and explore disabled people's relationship to the medical system. When someone has a severe accident, such as what happened to Frida at age 18, the natural reaction is to turn to the medical system for a cure. Crisis management, diagnosis, and treatment of short-term curable problems are strengths of Western medicine. But long-term, incurable medical conditions are not. As many people with disabilities can tell you, medical resources for long-term disability is often significantly less effective at giving someone a good quality of life than resources found by connecting with others living with similar chronic conditions. Frida Kahlo's decision to repeatedly look for a cure within the medical system, and as you know, she's had over 32 surgeries, she's looking for a cure in a medical system that demonstrably is unable to provide for people with complex medical needs, provide a cure, is fascinating. Now, I'd guess that most of us in this room who are over the age of 50 are living with some kind of chronic condition. And I would also guess that at the beginning of it, we sought a cure from the medical world. But when that didn't work, we started making adjustments to our lives in order to live with this chronic condition. And after 5 years or 10 years, the chronic condition just becomes a part of everyday life, including pain. If we're lucky, we have a condition that's common enough that there are good online resources put together by people with similar conditions. And if we are extremely lucky, we get to meet with people with similar conditions to get support and resources that comes from this shared lived experience. So in summary, for new medical problems, people seek a medical cure. For long-term medical problems, creating a life with quality often means looking for connections with other people who have figured out how to live this way. Question. Am I on a question? No, I'm not on a question. No, I'm not on a question. No, I'm not on a question yet either. All right, I have a question. Is there a difference in our perceptions of Frida Kahlo if we view her as sick versus if we view her as permanently disabled? Yes, we are. I want to spend a few minutes exploring the way that Kahlo and her artworks are viewed with a medical gaze. Hallmarks of the medical gaze include viewing people as sick, viewing people as other, and viewing people as dependent. With the medical gaze, where is the focus? Medical information is important. Medical professionals are experts. There's a focus on the cure. Non-disabled family speaks for the disabled person. And on the patient side, the medical gaze requires the disabled person to be compliant with medical professionals, compliant with their assigned sick role, focus solely on getting better, do not be a burden, be grateful to non-disabled people for putting up with you, and one must never, ever consort with other disabled people because that means giving up on the cure. So questions. How does the medical gaze impact our understanding of Kahlo's life and work? And what does adhering to a sick role require of Kahlo as an artist? One of my big questions going into the research for this talk was whether or not the medical gaze would be present and prominent in museum exhibits on Frida Kahlo's work. And as I said, and as Hillary said before me, people have an almost insatiable need to see work that's related to Frida Kahlo. So there's a lot of exhibits around the world, kind of all the time. To prepare for this talk, I reviewed exhibit object lists, meaning lists of what is in different exhibits around the world, what text is on the wall, the big signs that you see when you get in a room and it says, this is how we want you to think about what's in this room, reviews of those exhibits, interviews with curators of exhibits, and I looked at exhibits in 3 places. In Mexico, primarily at the Frida Kahlo Museum, in England, particularly the Victoria and Albert exhibit that a lot of the subsequent exhibits on appearances are deceiving is based, and also in the United States, particularly the work that was done at the Brooklyn Museum. And I focused on the objects that are related to the exhibit that's coming here, which were the ones that were found when the rooms were opened in 2004 at the Blue House. I found that these exhibits, frequently had about 250 objects, and this is just, I'm kind of giving you amalgamated numbers here. So of the roughly 250 objects, typically 50 to 60 of them were medically related objects, like medical notes, equipment, medications, pictures of doctors. Roughly another 50 were personal objects, makeup, jewelry, clothing, as Hillary mentioned. There's, what did she say, 21, 22 outfits from Frida's life. Usually there's about 30 pieces of art made by Frida. Typically there's a few more paintings than there are drawings. Often there's 10 objects related to Diego Rivera, and then a few, in some cases 3 or 4, images of Frida actually making art, performing the role of artist. By looking at these objects, they're neutral. Looking at a sample of the wall text for the exhibits brings some focus and tells us some of the perspectives, or maybe an indication of some of the perspectives of the curatorial staff. So a typical exhibit might have around 2,600 words. And when I did an analysis of that across different exhibits, I found that about 50 Frida's name came up in various configurations about 50 times. References to sickness, operations, corsets came up about 24 times. References to her, particularly to her clothing, came up 19, 20 times. Diego Rivera's name in various iterations, Diego Rivera, husband, 14 times. Frida's referred to as an artist about 7 times. Her dad comes into the picture about 5 times. Diego is referred to specifically as an artist about 4 times. The doctors are named 3 times, and it's pretty rare to see any personality characteristics on wall text in relation to the exhibit of these particular objects, and I just found one that it was specifically called her intelligent and outspoken in a pre-accident, post-polio, meaning after the age of 6, before the age of 18 context. So these objects can be interpreted in many ways, but many exhibit wall texts lean heavily towards a medical gaze by focusing on medical framings, prioritizing the perspectives of non-disabled people, and framing the objects from a non-disabled perspective. Question: does exhibit wall text, Does exhibit wall text frame objects in relation to a medical gaze? How does this show up in curating and reviewing Frida Kahlo's life and work? It shows up in a couple of different ways. It shows up with the idea that medical information is important. Her medical conditions are mentioned, doctor's notes are included, there's a lot of focus on pain and suffering. Medical experts are also prominent. Medical professionals are given a prominent place, and we see actual doctors and art by Frida that specifically references her doctors. There's often a focus on fixing the broken body. There's discussions of what medical interventions were done, how many surgeries she's had, what equipment she used. And this comment is extremely common in discussions of Frida's choice of clothing. Quote, "The adornment of the dress is centered around the upper part of the body, obliging the viewer to focus on Frida's upper body and providing her with the opportunity to edit and fragment herself, distracting the viewer from her legs and lower part of her body." Which leads me to my question to ponder. And questions are just for pondering. There's no right or wrong here. Just introducing new ways of thinking about some of these things. Or maybe not new to you, new to some of us. Did Kahlo wear long skirts because she was ashamed of her legs, or because she wanted to stop the medical gaze from strangers? As Hillary mentioned, there's many ex votos or these votive paintings in the exhibits that are traveling around with these materials that were found in 2004. And so again, the ex votos are small, hand-painted stories of a tragedy, such as an accident or a severe illness, and the family is typically praying for divine intervention, often from the Virgin, in Catholic context, not in Madonna context, not in pop star Madonna, religious Madonna. Okay, just want to make sure we're on the same page here. Okay, question. Did Kahlo have ex votos because she was hoping for a divine cure, or because she felt connected to people who had suffered similar physical trauma? In contrast, or in another way to think about it, to a medical gaze, we could be looking at Frida's work through a loving disabled gaze, which quite frankly, those of us who have visible disabilities, or at least me and my friends, I certainly don't want to be looked at when I go to the grocery store as the unwelcome other. I would like to have people think that I belong there and I'm just part of us, and that the loving disabled gaze means that the world that they believe in encompasses people that look like me. So where's the focus in the loving disabled gaze? It's on disabled people's actual experiences. It's on equipment as background. So I'm not the wheelchair in the room. I'm the really fun woman who's talking to you right now about this weird Frida Kahlo stuff and riding a wheelchair. So languages might be a way that somebody might frame that push the equipment to the background. Medical information is minimal. I don't care if you know that I'm disabled, but my medical information is not something I'm going to start talking about here, unless I'm talking to somebody else with a similar disability and I want to share information and resources. The disabled person defines their own experience. So I can say my life is a tragedy, I can say my life is wonderful, it doesn't matter. It's my view of my experience that is what is believed, and not a doctor's assessment or a non-disabled person in my life's assessment of the quality of my life or my experiences. And that non-disabled people's perspectives are important only if deemed so by the disabled person. So we speak for ourselves, however we do that, whether we type, whether we sign, it doesn't matter. So the question here that I want to offer you is, how might exhibit wall text for these exhibits frame objects in relation to a loving disabled gaze? Now, there's a museum of science and medicine in London called the Wellcome Collection. And in that collection, they have a lot of medical objects. They've been collecting medical objects for a very long time. And one might think that that's the last place to look for advice on disability-positive framings of objects. But the Wellcome Collection takes the position that what's been missing is not how to design the objects or how doctors use them medically, but what's been missing is the stories of the users of objects, particularly medically related objects. So when they present an object, such as an orthopedic corset, sorry, Boston got in there, corset, the wall text focuses on the experiences and knowledge of the users of the orthopedic corsets. So my question, why did Frida decorate her plaster corsets? Now I'm going to take us on a little San Francisco journey next. I want to talk about Frida Kahlo and Dorothea Lange. And since Dorothea Lange is a big deal here, I'm going to kind of assume that most of you, I'm going to kind of keep it short. Dorothea Lange, famous photographer, white woman, her collection is at UC Berkeley and the Oakland Museum, have the vast majority of her negatives. A whole bunch of her work was during the Great Depression, and the federal government and the Library of Congress has tons of stuff available of her photographs online. So I want to pause it, and Dorothea Lange had polio. And so I want to focus on this connection between Dorothea and Frida Kahlo around both being women that had polio and some other connections. So connecting to other people with similar disabilities is a critical part of survival. Other disabled people will provide knowledge and strategies and also look at us with a loving gaze in a world that often is not looking at us that way. Now, we have very little information about how Frida Kahlo connected with other people. But one of the few examples we do have is how Frida Kahlo connected with another disabled woman in her friendship with Dorothea Lange, the famous photographer. In the early 1930s, Frida Kahlo accompanied Diego Rivera to San Francisco, where she met the photographer Dorothea Lange. This photo by Imogene Cunningham, a local, very famous San Francisco photographer, is from 1931, so it was the time that Frida was here, and would have looked like what Frida looked like at the time she and Dorothy were meeting. The two women bonded over many things. They were strong women artists. They both had polio. They both walked with a noticeable limp. They both had artist husbands. They both had strong political views and took public stands for justice. And they both had philandering husbands. Lang, who was 12 years older, offered Kahlo support and studio space as well. And as their friendship developed, Kahlo shared some of her medical concerns with Lang. And this is a picture of Dorothea Lang a few years after this time, but roughly a picture from basically the same time. And Dorothea it's one of the kind of classic Depression pictures of her. She's up on the top of a car with her camera. Actually, I think they called it a truck. One of Lang's clients was Dr. Hillary got it right, I'm gonna struggle with it. Dr. Leo Eloesser. Okay, thank you. Dr. Leo Eloesser, who's a respected thoracic surgeon, who also spoke Spanish and went on to become a lifelong friend and medical consultant for Frida Kahlo. So Dorothea Lang was the bridge to him. I want to note that sharing resources, particularly medical-related resources, is a key benefit of disabled people knowing each other. And that one of the ironies of the friendship between Frida Kahlo and Dorothea Lang was their completely opposite approaches to self-portraits. And I'm just putting up a picture of a Frida Kahlo portrait that I'm madly in love with. I just love the connection, the roots growing, the earth growing, whatever. Kahlo frequently created self-portraits while Lang only created in her entire life. Now think about this. Those of you that take pictures, especially we take a bazillion more pictures than we could ever look at in our lifetimes. In Dorothea Lang's entire life, she took one self-portrait. For me, this difference between these two women and the self-portrait also illustrates the ways in which Kahlo developed a loving disabled gaze on her own body, while Lang kept to a more medicalized gaze on hers, on Lang's own body. I'm gonna diverge for just a quick second. There's a Berkeley writer named Ann Finger, and she wrote a fabulous short story where she imagines herself as a 12-year-old girl, and she falls asleep in front of the TV, and she imagines Frida Kahlo and Helen Keller meeting each other and actually having a kiss, but that's a whole other story. But here's what I want to put in here. This is how Ann Finger, who's a white, physically disabled woman, is describing Kahlo in the short story. Quote, Kahlo, who lifts her skirt to reveal the gaping, cunt-like wound on her leg, who rips her body open to reveal her back, a broken column, her back corset with its white canvas straps, framing her beautiful breasts, her body stuck with nails. But she can't be disabled. She's sexual. Frida, you painted those endless self-portraits, but you always looked at yourself live, straight on, in full light. In all those self-portraits, you are simultaneously artist and subject, lover and beloved, the bride of yourself. And in my experience of when disabled women are writing about Frida Kahlo, even women that have no cultural connection to Latinx culture, to Mexican women, to that time period, we have this visceral, profound connection with the art that Frida Kahlo made. That it speaks to us like soul to soul, and I feel like Ann Finger captured that there. So Dorothea Lang got polio at the age of 7, a year older than Frida did. Both immediately adopted long socks and pants to cover the atrophy that resulted from the polio. But while Kahlo was painting her disabled body for all to see, Lang was hiding it. And here's a picture of Lang, Dorothea Lang, that was taken by Imogene Cunningham, when Dorothea Lang was in her 60s. In her entire life, Dorothea Lang took only one self-portrait, and not until she was in her 60s. And here's the story. While teaching at the California School for Fine Arts in the 1950s, Lang gave her photography students an assignment to produce a photograph on the theme called, quote, "Where I Live." And she was clear that she didn't want them just to take a picture of their house. She wanted them to think about what was the space they spiritually inhabited. Now, her friend and fellow photographer, Imogene Cunningham, also taught at the school, and challenged Lang to do the assignment. So, where do you live? So Lang took photographs of her own polio foot in response. Of her polio, and this is literally, according to her biographers, this is literally the only self-portrait that Dorothea Lang ever took, was a picture of her polio foot. And those of you that don't know polio, those of us that have a particular kind of polio, Frida's foot would have looked like this, my foot looks like this, Dorothea Lang's foot like this. There's a kind of universality to the way that the atrophy of the muscles happens. So that resonance would have been there between them, and that resonance continues for me as a woman looking at this picture many years later. Of her polio, Dorothea Lang wrote, "It formed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me. All those things at once. I've never gotten over it, and I am aware of the power and the force of it." So my question, how does disability shame show up in self-portraits? Nearly all the writings about Frida Kahlo laying in bed portray it as a dismal experience. The idea of being in a long convalescence is assumed to be a horrible experience. This is a typical description I found in one of the places. Quote, "During her months of confinement to a bed after the bus accident, Frida Kahlo mastered the art of self-obsession." Now, I know many people that have created a life in bed and have written about it with a much more nuanced experience. I'm going back to Rabbi Elliot Kukla, who's a Jewish disabled trans man who spent nearly 4 years in bed. He writes, "Eventually, I stopped pushing for a cure. I stopped trying to overcome disability and started to live a full, sick, and disabled life. As the pace of my outer life slowed, my inner life expanded in unexpected ways. Some days being chronically ill just really sucks. And on other days it offers stillness, empathy, and solitude. The tender intimacy and vulnerability of receiving care, I'm grateful that my pain and discomfort have now eased, and I no longer live my life in bed. But sometimes I miss the profound and painful spirituality of bed life." Continuing on the theme of the bed, queer disabled Latinx artist Annie Segura, who's on social media as Annie Elaney, also spent long periods in bed. And she created a little piece that I really love. She wanted to create some art showing her connection to Frida Kahlo's ability to document the complexity of bed life. The images of Frida's life and art on the slides are the ones that Annie chose to accompany this text. Annie says, "As I was looking through Frida Kahlo's image results on Google, it really hit me how she absolutely refused to be invisible as somebody with chronic pain. There are so many photos of her in bed. There are so many photos of her with her working and painting in bed. Photos of her casts, photos of her sitting down while others are standing up. It would have been so easy to be invisible to the world. She could have easily said, 'I never want my picture taken when I'm in bed.' It's not a particularly common portrait to see photos of people in bed, but that's where she spent a lot of her time, and so she wanted these pictures to live. She included her bed and her casts and her pain in her art as well. So I'm thankful for that visibility. I've yet to see another person in history that I could identify with so much. And I'm going to end this presentation by talking about some contemporary disabled women and how the traditions, the echoes of Frida Kahlo's imagery and her artwork live on in the ways that contemporary disabled women are playing with the self-portrait. So the first images are from the Taiwanese disabled artist Chun-Chan Sandy Yi, who lives in Chicago. And Sandy calls her work crip couture. And those of you who, if you want to know why the word CRIP is being used, you can look at the work in disability studies. And there's also a film coming out in a few weeks on Netflix called Crip Camp, CRIP Camp. And so that word's going to come in. It's going to 190 countries, so it's going to be a pretty widespread film. So we'll be talking about that word the next time I see you. You'll all be going, yeah, we know what crip means. Okay, so this is the work of Sandy Yi. So these slides show the hand prosthetics she made for herself and also for disabled artist Sonora Taylor. And this is what Sandy says about her work. Rather than rejection of the notion of physical alteration, I have created intimate and empathetic bodily adornment, not as a correctional aid, but as a tool for remapping and engaging with a new physical terrain, one embodied with personal standards of physical comfort and self-identified ideals of beauty. And by the way, in this image, she made all of it. She made the latex, she made the plaster, like she did it all from scratch. The next slide is a self-portrait from Sonora Taylor, who is coming to Berkeley in the fall as a UC Berkeley professor, who's also a very prominent animal rights and disability rights activist and artist, and as you can see, a painter. In this portrait, she paints herself next to a manatee, since for her, the shapes of both of their bodies echo. White disabled portrait artist Riva Lair, who is based in Chicago, created this self-portrait showing herself naked from the waist up while she walks through water. She titled it, quote, 66 degrees, which is the amount that the doctors measure for the curvature of her spine. And the final self-portrait is from Berkeley artist Patricia Byrne. Patty spends a lot of time in bed and runs the disability justice arts organization Sins Invalid from her bed. This self-portrait combines elements of her Haitian and Japanese heritage with a joyful and artistic portrait of herself. I just want to end on a personal note. My first encounter with Frida was in the beautiful color plates in the middle of Hayden Herrera's book on Frida Kahlo in the 1980s, which I just found wandering through the bookstore. I had been a part of the disability rights movement in Berkeley, and I figured, I got this down, I found my people, it's all cool. And then I saw her pictures, and a part of me opened up like I have never been broken open before. She showed the world a view of vulnerability, pain, and passion that I knew from my disabled body, and I had never seen anything like it. Even though I was a low-paid childcare worker making $600 a month, when I saw that her paintings were coming to Los Angeles, I knew that I needed to go. So I drove down to LA and went to a huge exhibit on 30 centuries of Mexican-American art at the Los Angeles County Museum. Her work was in the last room. As I turned the corner into that room, the sight of her paintings stopped me cold. The paintings were so large in my mind, and yet so small on those walls. I slowly moved from painting to painting, noticing that the color reproductions in the books were technically accurate, but missed all of the emotional power of the originals. After I circled the room, I parked myself in the middle of the exhibit and I wept. I sat there for an hour and a half crying, and I did not do this. I felt like someone had taken all the secrets inside me and put them up on the wall. And for the first time in my life, I felt seen and beautiful in a museum. Her art showed how living with disabilities can feel in a body, the pain of surgery, what post-surgical pain looks like, the duality of living as a subjugated disabled life while wearing the costume of non-disability in order to have access to the world. Frida's painting screamed, "I am here, I am powerful, nothing can destroy me. I am my own creation, I am beautiful, and I deserve to be surrounded by beauty, and I deserve to be loved and admired by myself and by the world." And as a disabled person who found myself through Frida Kahlo, I am profoundly grateful today for this opportunity you've given me. Thank you.